All right, so let's talk about JPA. Um, so JPA, as I mentioned, right? It stands for Java Persistence API, and persistence as in storage. We want to be able to store permanently data that for the long term, it creates an API that allows you to interact with any number of strategies of storage, right? Certainly, it allows you to store data in relational databases, but also non-relational databases, XML. You can JSON, any number of storage mechanisms, right? We're going to spend most of our time interacting with relational databases, right? Since they are the dominant form of data storage out there, and for the foreseeable future. And so we'll spend some time on how is it that we can map object-oriented ideas of manipulating data in memory in running software, and how can those changes and manipulation of that data can be mapped down into permanent storage in a relational database, right? We will be using a Spring Boot, the same project that you might have already started a couple of weeks ago at the very beginning, that you should already have up and running. We also created one last time we met, a very simple application. Now, if you remember when we talked about JDBC, we talked about that the examples that we were looking had a lot of hard-coded content in there, right? It had a lot of URLs that were referencing the running server, right? And we had it hard-coded in the code, right? And that URL, we noticed that there were some things that were were dependent on the specific vendor that you were connecting to, right? For instance, we were using MySQL. Well, the URL actually contained JDBC:MySQL, right? And I pointed out to you that kind of breaks the mantra where Java, it's compile once, run anywhere, right? We would want to instead move all those configurations outside of the code, right, and put it in some configuration file. Yes. I also pointed out that same thing when we were loading the driver, right? The driver was also MySQL dot com.mysql.driver something. It was a class, right, that we were loading dynamically from within the source code. That again, that kind of broke the idea that we want our source code to be agnostic, right? It should be completely unaware of which vendor, which version are you actually using, right? That you should be able to compile regardless of what vendor you're using. So today we're going to introduce how would you go about doing that, right? We'd like to be able to configure a lot of all this outside of the source code, right, and somehow be referenced from inside, and everything works fine, right? So we're going to be today we're going to be using what is under resources directory. We're going to be adding an application.properties file, and in there we're going to be able to configure a lot of the configuration that we mentioned earlier, right? We're going to be able to configure the URL of which data source we're going to be connecting to, so that no longer will the source code be dependent on this. Yes. Same thing, we will configure the driver that we're going to be using, the username and password. All these things that we were hard coding in the source code, those should not be in the source code, right? We're going to move them over into a configuration file. Okay. The other thing that this is going to buy us is that we're going to use JDBC has two versions. We looked at the simpler version that we talked about last week, and it has a more advanced version that lives actually in a different package. Instead of being java.sql whatever, it's actually javax.sql, right? It's part of the extension package, and it has many additional features that we didn't cover last week, right? For instance, one of the cool features that you have in the newer version of JDBC is that in the results set that you're playing around with for the current assignment, you can only move forward, next, right? In the more advanced features, you can actually go backwards too, previous. You can traverse the results set backwards and forwards. You can also jump, forward, skip ahead 100 records down or up. You can random access the entire data set, even though the data set obviously is cached, right? If there's 10,000 rows that meet your criteria, it doesn't load 10,000 rows in memory, right? It must instead only load enough to be able to iterate over, right? And manages the cache for you, right? So it's very, very powerful. So anyway, those are some really cool features. But one of the most powerful features in the JDBC Java X version is that it supports connection pooling. Right? Connection pooling allows you to create much more performance database-driven applications. Right? As I mentioned last week, connecting to a database is very, very expensive. Right? And usually when you get a connection to a database, usually you keep that connection around. Right? You just don't throw it away like we were doing last week, right? We were opening the connection and then closing it, and then opening it again and then closing it. Yes, in the newer version, you can leave that connection around and create a pool of connections, right? Where that are meant to be shared amongst multiple threads, right? If you have multiple threads running and one is doing an insert and the other one's doing an update, and each one is a different threads are manipulating, interacting with the database, you want to keep track of maybe 10, 20, 30 connections that have already been created, right? Already connected to a database. There are live connections to a database, right? And you don't throw them away, right? Instead, you share them, right, into a pool, so that instead of closing the connection, a thread would release the connection and it would go back into the pool. Right? And then another thread would come back and say, I need a connection. It would come and get the connection from the pool and then keep using it. Yeah, this increases performance, several orders of magnitude. Right? It's much more efficient use of the of resources. Another thing that it supports is connection threshold throttling, connection throttling, meaning as the server needs more threads and it needs to maybe the load on the server increases over time over the day and then weans down later on during the day. It needs the load increases and it needs more connections, right? So you can configure it so that the pool grows over the day, right? And then before it starts only with only 10 connections, and as you as multiple threads are asking for more connections, the database the server can send, and instantiate 10 more connections. So it widens the pool to maybe 20 connections, and then 30, and then 40, right? And then as the day progresses and it starts to wean down, obviously the application is asking for more memory from the CPU and from the machine. It even can be shared amongst multiple machines, right? And over time, it can release these connections. You can set thresholds that there's a maximum number of connections that you can open up at any one time. Also the thresholds, when are you going to reach a threshold to start asking for more connections? Very, very powerful stuff. Anyway, everything's configurable. All these new features are implemented through the JPA interface that we're going to be using. And you can configure all these features from the application.properties. I mean, we're not going to get into some of the very, very powerful advanced features. We're going to learn how to use the JPA to connect to database. And certainly there's tons and tons of, there's hundreds of things that can be configured. And probably we're going to just skim the surface. So the things that we're going to configure is in the data source, we're going to configure first the location of your server. Where is the database servers running? And there's certain name value pairs that you can configure. One of them is the spring.datasource.url. That is the location of your server. So instead of doing a class.for name in JDBC, this is where you put it. This is where you put the URL. I'm sorry. Instead of doing the driver.connect, right, and get connection, and you put the URL, this is where you put the URL, right? Same thing instead of putting in the get connection, you put username and password. You configure it out here, right? You say username, password. Also, these instead of hard coding in here, you would typically what you would do is that you would create environment variables, right? Run it that are part of the CPU of the machine. When it boots up, it runs your, sets your batch file or your that sets up environment variables that you might have multiple databases, right? That are running either locally in your machine or running on your QA environment or your production environment, and you might have different username and passwords in your environments, right? So instead of hard coding your username and passwords here, typically these would instead be environment variables that can be loaded and referenced here, so that the connection will use the right database in different environments, right? Locally, it'll use my local host. When I deploy it on Heroku in my QA environment, it'll use Heroku's database with username and password remotely, right? And in production, it'll use a username and password for production. Make sense? So, very, very powerful. Other things here is that other things that can be configured is the DDL. DDL, data definition language, is that you can ask the JPA to handle all the schema for you, right? Meaning, instead of us creating a table right from scratch, we can ask JPA to create the tables for us, right? Meaning, here's a class, with modules or courses or employees or whatever, with usernames and passwords and social security numbers and salary and date of birth and whatnot, right? With all the fields, and you can tell JPA to say, hey, use this class and create an equivalent schema for me, right? And it'll go on and create it for you, and you can configure whether it'll create it from you from scratch, right? You can also configure it to also do updates, meaning, as I manipulate my data model and I add new fields or I change different data types, right? That instead of an integer, I want to use a string and whatnot. JPA is smart enough to say, ooh, I'll go and change the data type in the database, the schema. Obviously, this makes sense if this is a new database, right? I own the entire stack, and maybe it's a new project, and I'm creating the schema from scratch. Then I might do this, right? I might ask JPA to do this for me, right? To create the schema, to maintain the schema for me. Obviously, if this is a project that has been going on for years, and just now we're adding JPA, right? It would make no sense to have JPA handle the schema for you, right? This is a database that's been has been in use for years, right? You're not going to come in and try to manipulate the schema. It's very dangerous, right? You would instead perhaps turn it off, so you can turn it off and say none, meaning JPA don't handle the schema for me. You can also turn on multiple logging features, so that you can debug the whatever JPA is doing underneath, right? Meaning, instead of us using JDBC to to type the SQL language, commands are going to be used to communicate with the database. Instead, JPA is going to be doing that, right? JPA is going to be writing the inserts for us, the selects, the deletes, the updates for us, right? And oftentimes we might not agree with what JPA is doing, right? And says, well, no, I would have written it differently. That's that SQL statement. So oftentimes we want to see the actual SQL that is being used, right? So that you says, why is this not working the way I want? Like, you can copy the SQL, go and log into your database and actually run the SQL script, right? And see if it does what you're intended to do, right? And see what the error might be. So yeah, you can turn this on for debugging purposes. This is something you would do in your development environment, as you're designing the database and you're just starting. Usually in production, you would turn this off, right? In production, you don't want lots of logging because it's very verbose, right? It writes a lot of logging information that, again, for development and for debugging purposes, great, but not in production. You would turn that off. You can also turn on the different strategies for naming strategies, because the way we name things in Java is very different the way we name things in SQL, right? In Java, usually we use we have a naming convention where we camel case things, right? Variables start with a lowercase, and then we capitalize every word at the beginning, the first letter of every word. If it's a long word or a compound word. But in SQL, right, capitalization is it's insensitive, right? So instead, in SQL, you might use underscores instead, right, to separate words. Yes. So you can configure that too. You can tell JPA to handle that for you, right? If I name this first first name in in Java with capital N, all lowercase with capital N, right? JPA will be smart enough to say, oh, the way I'm going to write the schema for you, that actually maps to a field called first underscore name, right? It'll know, how they map these two worlds for you. That's the mapping part, the ORM, right? The mapping part, right? The object world, we use one naming convention, and in the relational world, we use a different naming convention, right? And the mapping is done for you, ORMs. Also, you can configure the dialect, right? What version of SQL are you using, right? So that JPA can know, what is the underlying vendor that I'm talking to? Is it Oracle? Is it SQL Server? Is it MySQL? What is it, right? And it can then use the correct SQL, right, to create foreign keys and primary keys and the alters and the different all the schemas are slightly different, right, depending on which dialect of SQL you're using. So you can configure that as well. What language do you want me to talk? Other things, we can format, we can trace. These are mostly for other logging that we can print out to the command line. So anyway, so let's go ahead and configure ours. Right, we're going to copy this. Most of this we're going to copy. Let's see. So inside of application properties, right now, I believe in our own, it's not configured. So let's take a look at that next.